The rain did not fall so much as it hung in the air, a cold, cloying mist that clung to Elias's trench coat like a second skin. It was 3 in the morning, the hour of the wolf, when the city of London shed its bustling veneer and revealed its skeletal, industrial framework. Elias stood under the flickering halo of a dying street lamp, watching the crimson taillights of the N29 bus fade into the gloom. He had missed it by seconds. A groan of frustration escaped his lips, manifesting as a plume of white vapor. The next bus wasn't due for another hour, and the concept of waiting on this exposed, wind-battered corner was physically painful. His apartment was only a 20-minute walk if he stuck to the main roads, brightly lit, monitored by CCTV, safe. But 20 minutes felt like an eternity to a man whose bones ached from a double shift at the hospital. There was, of course, the shortcut. Elias looked toward the mouth of Harrow Alley. It wasn't really an alley anymore. It was a vestigial limb of the old Victorian canal system, a narrow cobblestone path flanked by high brick walls and overgrown elderberry bushes that blotted out the sky. It cut diagonally through the block, shaving the walk down to a mere 7 minutes. Locals called it the Throat, mostly because of how it seemed to swallow the light, but also because of the urban legends whispered by school children. "Don't go into the Throat at night," they said. "The echoes don't come back right." Elias, a man of science and sutures, rubbed his tired eyes. He didn't believe in ghosts, and he certainly didn't believe in urban folklore. He believed in exhaustion, in the warmth of his bed, and in the sheer statistical improbability of anything happening to a 6-foot-tall man in a city of 9 million people. He adjusted his bag, turned up his collar, and stepped into the darkness. The transition was immediate. The ambient hum of the city, the distant sirens, the tire on wet asphalt hiss, was severed the moment he passed the first bend. Silence rushed in to fill the void, heavy and oppressive. The air here was colder, smelling of wet rot, stagnant water, and ancient brick dust. The streetlights from the main road could not penetrate the canopy of neglected trees that arched overhead, their branches interlocking like skeletal fingers. Elias walked briskly, his footsteps clapping loudly against the wet stones. Clack, clack, clack. He kept his eyes forward, fixed on the faint gray smudge in the distance that marked the other end of the alley. He tried to occupy his mind with a mental checklist of tomorrow's tasks, but the atmosphere of the alley was intrusive. It demanded attention. The shadows seemed to pool in the corners, darker than the night itself, possessing a fluidity that made his peripheral vision twitch. About halfway through, the sensation hit him. It was a primal, atavistic prickling at the base of his neck, the lizard brain screaming a warning that civilized evolution had tried to bury. "You are being watched." Elias paused. The sound of his footsteps ceased, but for a fraction of a second, the rhythm seemed to continue. A single, soft scuff echoed from behind him. He whipped around, his heart hammering a sudden, violent rhythm against his ribs. "Hello?" he called out. His voice sounded thin, swallowed instantly by the damp walls. Nothing but the dark tunnel stretching back the way he had come. A discarded newspaper tumbled across the stones, pushed by a draft that he couldn't feel. "Get a grip, Elias," he muttered, turning back around. He forced a chuckle, but it sounded dry and brittle. It was just the acoustics of the tunnel, a delayed echo, simple physics. He resumed walking, faster this time. Clack, 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 clack. Scuff, scuff. He froze again. The sound had stopped, but not immediately. Whoever, or whatever, was behind him had taken 2 more steps before realizing Elias had halted. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise in his chest. This was not an echo. An echo does not have weight. An echo does not try to hide itself. Elias didn't turn around this time. He knew the rule of the predator and prey. To show fear is to trigger the attack. Instead, he lengthened his stride, abandoning the pretense of a casual walk. He was speedwalking now, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The gray smudge at the end of the tunnel seemed impossibly far away, retreating with every step he took. The footsteps behind him sped up, matching his cadence perfectly. They were heavy, wet slaps against the stone, closer now. 10 yards? 5? The rational part of his brain disintegrated. He broke into a run. The darkness blurred around him. The overgrown bushes whipped at his face, leaving stinging scratches on his cheeks. He could hear the pursuer now, fully committed to the chase. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. It was the ragged, wet sound of breathing, guttural and deep, like air being pulled through fluid. "Hey, back off!" Elias shouted, not looking back, fumbling in his pocket for his keys to use as a weapon. He saw the exit, a wrought iron gate that marked the end of the throat. It was usually unlocked. It had to be unlocked. He sprinted, his lungs burning, the adrenaline flooding his system, turning the world into a tunnel of focus. He reached the gate and slammed his body against it, expecting it to swing open into the safety of the street. A heavy, rusted padlock, looped through the bars, held it fast. A sign, freshly put up, read, "Closed for maintenance." Elias rattled the gate violently, the metal clanging loud and desperate in the night. "No, no, no," he whispered, panic seizing his throat. He looked through the bars at the street beyond, so close, bathed in amber light, completely empty. The wet, ragged breathing stopped directly behind him. The air temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in a second. The smell of rot intensified, becoming almost unbearable, smelling of earth that had been turned over to bury something that didn't want to stay buried. Elias gripped the cold iron bars, his knuckles white. Slowly, terrified of what he would see but knowing he had no choice, he turned around to face the darkness of the alley. There was no one there. The path was empty. He let out a trembling breath, his knees nearly buckling with relief. It's just my mind," he wheezed. Then, from the darkness directly above him, nestled in the overarching branches of the ancient trees, a voice dripped down like thick syrup. "You should have taken the long way, Elias." The paralysis that gripped Elias was absolute, a primal freeze response hardwired into his DNA from ancestors who knew that to move was to die. His neck refused to crane upward, his muscles locked in a rictus of terror, yet his eyes betrayed him, rolling toward the canopy of the ancient oaks that loomed over the locked gate. Slowly, agonizingly, gravity seemed to invert. A shape detached itself from the gnarled embrace of the branches. It didn't fall so much as pour, a viscous shadow descending with the slow, deliberate grace of a spider on a dragline. It landed on the asphalt with a sound that made Elias's stomach turn. A wet slap, like a slab of raw meat thrown against a butcher's block. Elias scrambled backward, his heels scraping against the pavement, until his spine collided with the cold iron of the gate. He was trapped between the impossible and the impassable. The thing rose. It was vaguely humanoid, elongated and stretched as if pulled by unseen distinct forces. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, its skin the color of a bruised plum in the moonlight, slick with some secretion that caught the dim amber glow from the streetlights beyond the gate. It had no face, not in the traditional sense. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth, concave depression, save for a single vertical slit that pulsed with a faint, bioluminescent rhythm. "Elias," it whispered again. The voice didn't come from the slit. It vibrated in the air around them, resonating inside Elias's skull like a migraine. The shortcut, the rush, the arrogance. "What do you want?" Elias croaked, his voice cracking, stripping his throat raw. He gripped the keys in his pocket so hard the metal bit into his flesh, drawing blood. The creature took a step forward, its leg bent backward at the knee, a grotesque mimicry of canine anatomy. "To walk with you," it mused. "The throat is lonely at this hour. It hungers for company. It hungers for warmth." Elias's survival instinct finally overrode his paralysis. With a guttural scream, he turned his back on the nightmare and leaped at the gate. He jammed the toe of his sneaker into the wrought iron scrollwork, his fingers clawing for purchase on the rusted bars. If he could just vault over, the street was right there. People, cars, safety. He hauled himself up, adrenaline granting him hysterical strength. He was halfway up the 10-foot gate when something cold and wet wrapped around his ankle. It wasn't a hand. It felt like a tongue, muscular, slimy, and incredibly strong. "No!" Elias shrieked, kicking wildly. His other foot connected with something solid, but the grip on his ankle tightened, crushing the bone. With a sickening yank, he was torn from the gate. The world spun, a kaleidoscope of black branches and amber light, before the pavement rushed up to meet him. He hit the ground hard, the air driven from his lungs in a wheezing gasp. Pain exploded in his shoulder, but the terror eclipsed it instantly. He scrambled into a crab walk, retreating until his back hit the brick wall of the alley. The creature stood over him now, blocking the path back the way he came. It wasn't attacking. Not yet. It was observing, its faceless head cocked to the side like a curious bird. "Why?" Elias wept, the keys slipping from his trembling fingers. "I just wanted to go home." "Home," the entity echoed, tasting the word. "A concept of boundaries, walls to keep the night out. But you invited the night in, Elias. You stepped into the veins of the city, thinking you were just passing through. But blood doesn't pass through. It circulates. It returns." The smell of rot became overpowering, a cloying miasma of decay and wet earth. The vertical slit on the creature's face began to widen, tearing open with the sound of wet fabric ripping. Inside, there were no teeth, only rows of cilia, undulating in anticipation. Elias looked around frantically. The gate was locked. The alley was blocked. But then, his eyes caught a subtle shift in the environment. To his left, where the brick wall of the old factory should have been solid, there was a section where the mortar had crumbled away near the ground, hidden behind a pile of sodden cardboard boxes. A drainage gap, small, tight, but perhaps just wide enough for a human to squeeze through if they were desperate enough. The creature stepped closer, its shadow swallowing him. Elias didn't think. He threw his keys, not at the monster, but at the metal dumpster to the right. Clang! The creature flinched, its sensory organs momentarily confused by the sharp, sudden noise. In that fraction of a second, Elias lunged to the left. He dove prone, tearing his shirt on the rough concrete, and shoved his head and shoulders into the drainage gap. It was tight, claustrophobically tight. The rough brick scraped the skin off his back, and the smell of sewage was immediate and choking. He kicked his legs frantically, pushing himself deeper into the hole just as he felt the rush of air from the creature's swipe. Claws, or whatever they were, raked across the sole of his shoe, slicing through the rubber, but missing his flesh. With a final, agonizing heave, Elias popped out the other side. He tumbled onto grass. Cool, manicured grass. He scrambled to his feet, chest heaving, expecting the creature to be right behind him, to liquefy itself and pour through the hole. But the gap in the wall here was covered by a heavy steel grate, bolted firmly in place. He backed away, panting, wiping sweat and grime from his eyes. He was in a park. Specifically, he was in the small community park that bordered the rich neighborhood just adjacent to the throat. He knew this place. He saw the familiar silhouette of the jungle gym, the swings swaying gently in the breeze, and beyond them, the comforting glow of streetlights lining a quiet suburban road. "I made it," he whispered, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in his chest. "Oh God, I made it." He turned and ran toward the street, limping slightly on his bruised ankle. He needed to find a house, ring a doorbell, call the police. He needed light. He reached the sidewalk and stopped. The silence was absolute. Not the quiet of a sleeping suburb, but the dead, vacuum-like silence of a void. There were no crickets, no distant hum of traffic from the highway, no wind in the trees. Elias looked at the house directly in front of him. It was a beautiful two-story colonial with a manicured lawn. The lights were on in the living room. He hobbled up the driveway, desperation propelling him. "Help!" he shouted, banging his fist on the front door. "Please, let me in! Someone was chasing me!" No answer. He pounded harder. "Please!" He moved to the window, cupping his hands against the glass to look inside, hoping to catch someone's attention. What he saw stopped his heart. The living room was furnished perfectly. There was a sofa, a television, a coffee table with a magazine on it. But everything was flat. The texture was wrong. The television wasn't a screen. It was a painted black rectangle. The fruit in the bowl was made of wax. And the people. Sitting on the couch were two figures. They were mannequins, perfectly dressed, with rigid plastic smiles, staring blankly at the painted television. Elias stumbled back, his breath hitching. What? He spun around to look at the street. Now that he focused, the streetlights weren't electric bulbs. They were glowing orbs of that same bioluminescent pulse he had seen on the creature. The cars parked on the street were smooth, seamless lumps of metal with windows painted in opaque black. He looked up at the sky. There were no stars, just a solid, oppressive ceiling of dark gray mist, swirling slowly, far too low to be clouds. From the direction of the park, from the direction of the steel grate he had thought was his salvation, a sound began to rise. It wasn't the guttural breathing of the creature. It was worse. It was applause. Slow, Elias turned back toward the park. Standing by the swings, no longer hiding in the shadows, was the entity. It wasn't alone. Behind it, emerging from the trees that looked more like jagged cutouts of cardboard, were others. Dozens of them. The entity raised a long, fluid arm and pointed at Elias. "I told you, Elias." The voice dripped into his mind, clearer now, intimate and terrifyingly close. "The throat is not just a place. It is a transition. You didn't escape. You just went deeper." The mannequins in the house behind him began to scratch at the glass. The sound of fingernails on glass is universally reviled, a screech that triggers a primal flinch in the human brain. But the sound emanating from the window behind Elias was not the sharp, brittle scratch of bone against silica. It was duller, wetter, like a knife dragging across taut rubber. Elias scrambled backward, his boots skidding on the porch wood that felt suspiciously soft, like hardened foam. Inside the house, the perfect family was pressing against the pain. Their plastic faces, once smooth and benign, were beginning to deform. The heat of their sudden animation was melting their features. The painted eyes were sliding down their cheeks like tears of black ink, and their rigid smiles were stretching into cavernous, toothless maws. The glass didn't shatter. It bulged outward, stretching like a translucent membrane, wrapping around the plastic hands that pushed relentlessly toward him. "This isn't real," Elias whispered, the mantra of the insane. "None of this is real. Reality is merely a consensus." The entity's voice purred in his mind, resonating not in his ears, but in the bone of his skull. "And here, Elias, I am the majority vote." The wet applause from the park grew louder, a thundering, rhythmic squelch that drowned out the pounding of his own heart. Elias tore his gaze away from the melting mannequins and threw himself off the porch, landing hard on the manicured lawn. The grass didn't smell of earth and chlorophyll. It smelled of old carpet and copper. He sprinted toward the street. The glowing orbs that mimicked streetlights cast a sickly, jaundice-colored hue over the neighborhood. As he ran, the facade of the world began to degrade, as if the budget for this nightmare was running out the further he moved from the center stage. The houses he passed were no longer three-dimensional. As he sprinted by a colonial-style home, he caught a glimpse of its side profile. It was flat, a mere cardboard cutout propped up by wooden struts, facing the street to deceive a stationary observer. But behind the props, in the negative space where a kitchen or a garage should have been, there was only a swirling gray void. "Where are you running to, little actor?" The voice mocked. It was closer now. Elias didn't look back. He could hear the things emerging from the park. Their movement was wrong. They didn't run with the chaotic cadence of predators. They moved in unison, a synchronized dance of jagged limbs and sliding shadows. The slap of their feet on the pavement matched the rhythm of the applause. Slap, clap, slap, clap. He aimed for the intersection ahead, hoping to find a main road, a break in the mist, anything. But as his feet struck the asphalt, he realized the texture of the ground was changing. The road, initially hard and cold, was becoming warm. It yielded under his weight, spongy and slick. He looked down. The seamless metal lumps that represented cars were sinking. The road wasn't asphalt, it was tissue. It was dark, purple, papillated flesh, vast and flat, stretching out into the darkness. He was running on a tongue. Bile rose in his throat, burning and acidic. The realization staggered him, causing him to stumble. "The throat is not just a place. You understand now," the voice whispered, dripping with satisfaction. The house, the park, the street, they are merely the texture on the tongue to make the swallowing easier. A lullaby before digestion. Elias scrambled up, his hands slick with the viscous saliva coating the street. He looked up at the sky, at the low, oppressive ceiling of gray mist. It was pulsing, a rhythmic contraction that matched the beating of a massive, unseen heart. The mist wasn't cloud cover. It was the roof of a mouth, closing slowly. Panic, raw and blinding, seized him. He saw a structure ahead that looked solid, a brick post office at the end of the block. It seemed to possess more depth than the cardboard houses. Desperation overriding logic, he sprinted toward it, his legs burning, his lungs screaming for air that was rapidly becoming too thick to breathe. Behind him, the applause stopped. The sudden silence was infinitely worse. It signaled the end of the performance. He reached the post office, slamming his shoulder against the heavy wooden door. Miraculously, it gave way. He tumbled inside, slamming it shut and throwing the bolt. He backed away into the darkness of the room, his chest heaving. "Hello?" he rasped, his voice trembling. The interior was dusty, smelling of dry paper and ink. It felt real. For a second, a spark of hope ignited in his chest. Maybe this was a safe room. Maybe there were rules to this place. He fumbled in his pocket for his lighter, the metal cold and reassuring against his thumb. He flicked the wheel. A small yellow flame sputtered to life, illuminating the room. It wasn't a post office. The walls were covered in photographs. Thousands of them. They were taped floor to ceiling, overlapping, chaotic. Elias stepped closer, raising the lighter. They were pictures of him. Elias sleeping in his bed. Elias buying coffee. Elias walking through the park 3 days ago. Elias reading a book as a child. Elias crying at a funeral. Every private moment, every secret shame, every second of his life had been documented, categorized, and pinned to the walls of this impossible room. And in the center of the room stood a desk. Sitting behind it was a figure. It wasn't a mannequin. It wasn't a shadow monster. It was Elias, or rather, a perfect copy of him. The other Elias was sitting calmly, hands folded on the desk, wearing the exact same clothes, down to the mud stains on the knees. The copy looked up, its eyes reflecting the flame of the lighter. But the eyes were dead, glassy and hollow, devoid of soul. The copy smiled. It wasn't a human smile. It was the hungry, anticipatory grin of a predator that had finished playing with its food. "Finally," the copy said, its voice identical to Elias's own, yet layered with the harmonic distortion of the entity. "I was wondering when I would get here." The copy stood up. As it did, its jaw unhinged, dropping unnaturally low, the skin stretching and tearing with a wet, fibrous sound. Inside the widening mouth, there were no teeth, only rows of bioluminescent lights and the deep, swirling gray of the void. Elias backed away, reaching for the door handle behind him, but his hand grasped nothing but soft, wet flesh. The door was gone. The walls of the room began to contract, the photos curling and dissolving into acid. The copy lunged, its mouth expanding to impossible proportions, blocking out the light, blocking out the world. End of part 1. The copy whispered from the darkness of its throat. And then, the light went out. The darkness was not an ending, but a violent rewriting. There was no pain, only the terrifying sensation of being unspooled, like a cassette tape dragged across a heavy magnet, erasing the music while leaving the plastic casing intact. The void did not consume Elias, it displaced him. Then, there was light. Not the flickering yellow of a dying flame, but the harsh, sterile glare of the morning sun. Elias gasped, his lungs filling with air that tasted sweetly of ozone and damp earth. He was lying on the cracked pavement outside the abandoned structure. The door was shut, rusted tight, looking as though it hadn't been opened in 50 years. The silence of the morning was broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the chirping of a naive sparrow. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees. The movement was fluid, precise, lacking the usual morning stiffness of a human body. He flexed his fingers, admiring the way the tendons moved beneath the skin. It was a perfect fit. A jogger ran past, slowing down to offer a concerned glance at the disheveled man. "Rough night, buddy?" Elias turned. The smile that spread across his face was practiced, charming, and entirely superficial. "You could say that," he replied, his voice resonating with a newfound hypnotic depth. "Just finishing the prologue." As the jogger continued, unaware of the predator standing in the daylight, the thing wearing Elias's face adjusted its collar and began the walk back to the city. The real Elias was gone, archived in the void, a cautionary tale for those who wander alone. The night had claimed its toll, and now the monster